Hello. Thank you so much for logging in to listen to my talk today, and thank you as always very much to the Fingal Festival of History for asking me to deliver the talk. I originally was asked to give this talk to commemorate Juneteenth, that anniversary that occurred earlier this year, and Juneteenth commemorates the 19th of June, 1865, when federal orders were read in Galveston, Texas, that previously all previously enslaved people in Texas were then free. Now, although the Emancipation Proclamation had freed those people almost 2.5 years earlier, Texas was the most remote slave state. It had the very low concentration of Union troops. So enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation was spotty at best. So this was when the last slaves heard that they were free. So that's the significance of Juneteenth, but in trying to decide further what I would include in this talk, I thought it would be a good idea to address some of the questions I've been asked by friends and colleagues over the past few months. First of all, how do we get to a place where George Floyd and so many other people could be murdered so callously? What happened? The U.S. had the Civil Rights Movement, didn't it? Didn't that fix all these issues? And why does everyone keep talking about slavery? That occurred 150 years ago. Surely that's not still relevant. And finally, explain Black Lives Matter to me. So in thinking about the answers to those questions, and as people who obviously are interested in history, you'll know it's really difficult to break with the past unless you understand it and its influence on the present. And again, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but that's why the study of history is so important. As American author William Faulkner famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And we are seeing the validity of that statement in the US. In fact, we've always seen the validity of that statement in the US. What we're seeing in the States isn't a new phenomenon there, and it can really trace its roots back to slavery, specifically how slavery had to be reconciled with the country's founding principles, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain rights, including liberty. So I'm going to talk about that and also share a great deal of African American history with you and relate it back to a lot of current events, and also try to give you some understanding of early systemic racism and its legacy. So quickly, I'll just give you an outline of the talk, and don't be scared of this. I know it looks like more than it really is. Some of the topics will go more quicker than others. So slavery and African American protest in the colonial and founding eras, the slave power and the social construct of race, race in America post-Reconstruction up to the 1920s, the Great Migration, African American progressive reform. I'm going to talk a little bit about blackface, from minstrel shows to gollywog dolls, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, the Red Summer of 1919, the Immigration Act of 1924. Then I'll move on to Confederate monuments, memory and history, the GI Bill and real estate covenants, race and civil rights legislation in the 1960s, the Boston busing crisis, and finally, Black Lives Matter and why this moment is so different in my opinion. The first 20 Africans arrived in America in 1619 in the Jamestown colony of Virginia. Directly or indirectly, the economies of all 13 British colonies in North America depended upon slavery. By the 1620s, the cultivation of tobacco for European markets was established in Virginia, with white indentured servants performing most of that labor. Before 1660, only a fraction of Virginia planters actually held slaves, but by 1675, slavery was well established, and by 1700, African slaves had almost completely replaced indentured servants as the primary labor source there. With plentiful land and slave labor available to grow a lucrative crop, Southern planters prospered, and family-based tobacco plantations became the economic and social norm. But as I said, slavery existed in the northern colonies as well, and I wanted to point out an early example of African American action against slavery, which occurred in Massachusetts. There were 3 ways that a slave could achieve freedom in colonial Massachusetts: escape, manumission, which was the legal act of an owner freeing a slave, or legal petition. In the early 1770s, groups of Black freemen and enslaved men submitted 5 separate petitions to the Massachusetts Council maintaining that slavery should be abolished. Prince Hall was born in 1738 and was the slave of William Hall of Boston, who was a tanner. A month after the Boston Massacre, Hall freed Prince. And Prince Hall ultimately founded the world's first Black Masonic Lodge, and he was its first Grand Master. The group was central to efforts to promote political and economic improvements for free Blacks in America, and it was a model for future Black social institutions with the same remit. Hall also chartered lodges in Philadelphia, Rhode Island, New York, and Connecticut, so he was very influential in the free Black community of Boston. 13th of January, 1777, Prince Hall and 7 other Black Bostonians presented a petition to the Massachusetts Council, which began, "The petition of a great number of Blacks detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country humbly showeth that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatsoever." These words echoed the language of the Declaration of Independence from the prior year, and although the petition was rejected, that tactic would go on to be used in African American protests for the abolition of slavery and civic inclusion throughout American history. After the Revolutionary War, which as a side note was until the Korean War, the last war that Blacks and whites fought together in integrated units. After the Revolutionary War, the United States attempted to govern itself under the Articles of Confederation among the states, but collecting taxes, raising an army, and trading were not being accomplished efficiently under that system, so it was determined that the government needed a central government. So in the boiling hot summer of 1787, delegates from each of the 13 states met in Philadelphia to draft the U.S. Constitution, which would structure the powers of the federal government and the states. When the delegates wrote and agreed upon the Constitution, cotton production was virtually non-existent in America. There were approximately 700,000 slaves in the U.S. at the time of the signing of the Constitution, and under the proposed Constitution, population affected 3 issues: how many members each state would have in the House of Representatives, how many electoral votes each state would have in presidential elections, the amount each state would pay in direct taxes to the federal government. But even though it required the southern states to pay more taxes, those states pushed to include slaves as part of their populations. The northern states obviously took issue with that because it would have given the South so much more influence in the federal government. So to mitigate that, a compromise was made. For population representation purposes, each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. It's called the 3/5 compromise. This is where the problems began, with this first compromise over slavery, and there would be many that followed it. The colonies had just fought a war to become independent and launch a great democratic experiment based on the Declaration of Independence. And right out of the gate is a 3/5 compromise. As a result of the compromise, the southern states had nearly 45% of the seats in the first U.S. Congress, which took a seat in 1790. And I'll be talking about this level of influence a lot more later. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, many northern states, including Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, had already abolished slavery. The southern states then were concerned that in the future, these states might provide refuge and protection for runaway slaves. So in addition to the 3/5 compromise, a fugitive slave clause was added to the Constitution. And it stated that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. The word slave was not mentioned there, and it was not mentioned in the Constitution, and this clause would have applied to an apprentice or an indentured servant, as well as a slave, but there were 700,000 slaves in the country, and this was included in the Constitution as part of a compromise with the South, so I think the intent for that is probably pretty clear. Congress would later pass 2 Fugitive Slave Acts in 1793 and 1850. And in return for the 3/5 compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause, Southern states agreed to stop importing slaves from Africa in 1808. So many members of the founding generation, including Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, spoke out against slavery, although many, including him and George Washington, were slaveholders. But historians argue that most of the founding generation assumed that slavery would simply die out. And it very well may have, had it not been for the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which reinvigorated the institution of slavery. I found that patent for that on the U.S. National Archives website. This archives site has a section called 100 Milestone Documents, documents that have left an indelible mark on America. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation, they're all there, as is the patent for the cotton gin. Before the invention of the cotton gin, production of cotton in the South was extremely labor intensive because mostly it was difficult to separate the cotton seed from the fiber. So therefore, only the largest plantations found raising cotton cost effective. And as you can see on this slide, the cotton gin was a machine that separated the fibers from the seeds. As a result, it became very lucrative and less labor intensive as a crop, and production rose exponentially in the Deep South. Consequently, slavery became incredibly profitable. This in turn led to an increase in the number of slaves and slaveholders in the South and to the growth of a cotton-based rather than a tobacco-based agricultural economy there. So to give you an idea of the profitability of slavery, by 1815 and up until the Civil War in 1861, cotton was the most valuable U.S. export. By the middle of the 19th century, the southern states were providing 2/3 of the world's supply of cotton. By 1860, slave labor was producing over 2 billion pounds of cotton per year. By 1820, slavery had moved into the deeper South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, as a result of the outlaw of the external African slave trade in 1808 by Congress, as dictated by the Constitution. So it became illegal to bring slaves into the U.S., but the slave trade remained legal within the country, and it flourished between the upper South and the lower South, and as the country expanded west, the expansion of slavery became an increasingly volatile issue. So with that kind of wealth available, planters in the American South were not about to follow the path of gradual emancipation that the northern states had. By 1804, all northern states had voted to abolish the institution of slavery within their borders, but in most of those states, that was established by gradual emancipation laws. And those laws established deadlines by which all slaves would be freed, either as they reached a particular age or at the end of a particular service period. However, gradual emancipation was not without its issues. For example, Pennsylvania passed its Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in 1780. Yet, as late as 1850, the federal census recorded that there were still hundreds of young blacks enslaved in Pennsylvania. In addition to enjoying the highest incomes in the South, planters dominated state and local political offices and the leadership of both political parties by 1850. In the 61 years between the presidential election of George Washington, the first president, and 1850, slaveholders controlled the presidency for 50 of those years. Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, and Taylor were all slaveholders. Slaveholders held the congressional Speaker of the House seat for 41 years. In addition to wielding immense political influence, the Speaker of the House is second in line to the presidency behind the Vice President. Lastly, 18 out of 31 Supreme Court justices were slaveholders. And those statistics constitute what historians mean by the slave power. That beginning with concessions in the U.S. Constitution, slaveholders stood on those and similar privileges and worked to expand their power over their slaves within Southern society and within state and national government. Behind the planter class stood the power of the state. Now, I was fortunate enough to work with a wonderful African-American history professor, James Oliver Horton, who said, "Think how different it would have been if American slavery had been predicated on the basis of power rather than race. If it had been predicated on the basis of power rather than race." And by power, I think he meant economic and social power, such as in an indentured servant relationship. When an indentured servitude period was over after, say, 7 years, that relationship didn't usually characterize the way that person and generations of his family were viewed by society. By race, Professor Horton was speaking of the social construct of race that underpinned slavery. A social construct, as you probably know, is defined as an idea that has been created and accepted by people in a society. So keeping in mind the slave power, in order to reconcile the very profitable institution of slavery with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, America's founding documents, certain things had to be determined and accepted about people of color, and ultimately not just Black people, that they were different, less intelligent, less worthwhile, less trustworthy, less human even, and that they had to be controlled. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed federal protection of citizenship, and the 15th prohibited voting restrictions based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So the institution of slavery ended with the Civil War, but that construct of race was still there. And over the next 100 years, that construct not only affected the efficacy of those amendments, but has also manifested itself in numerous ways over the past 155 years, including what you're witnessing right now. After the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction in 1877, when the last federal troops left the South, that accepted way of thinking underpinned attempts to disenfranchise African American men in the South by use of literacy tests and poll taxes, increased violence, including lynching against people of color, and the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan. I want to stop and talk about the Klan briefly, because the success of its second rise during the 1920s speaks to the power of the construct of race across the country, not just in the South, and decades after the end of the Civil War. I'm going to discuss some statistics courtesy of the American Public Broadcast System, American Experience website. But first, I want to mention the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the efforts of the Klan to take back the South after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Historians maintain that the film contributed significantly to that second rise of the Klan. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson screened the film at the White House. Thomas Dixon Jr., the author of the book upon which the film was based, was a former classmate and friend of the president's. By the middle of the decade, estimates for national membership ranged from 3 million to as high as 8 million Klansmen. The Klan expanded its targets to include Jews, Catholics, and foreigners, and promoted a devout patriotism as well as white supremacy. In Ohio, membership was 300,000. In Pennsylvania, membership reached 200,000. The membership was not only made up, though, of people who were uneducated or poor, it included members of the professional class as well. Sometimes that's something that people don't realize. And with those numbers, they were in a position to influence local and state politics. In 1924, the Klan succeeded in engineering the elections of the mayors of Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. And in some states, such as Colorado and Indiana, they placed enough Klansmen in positions of power to effectively control the state government. The institution of slavery was over, but the construct remained. In the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case in 1896, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities for African Americans were constitutional. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision provided legal justification for segregation on trains, buses, and in public facilities such as hotels, theaters, and schools, and it upheld the philosophy of racial segregation for the next 50 years. Laws such as these had been enforced in the South since the end of Reconstruction, but in 1896 they were given credence and federal protection by the Supreme Court. So for African Americans in particular, this period of the 1880s to the early 1900s was characterized by the need to regroup after a serious setback in the struggle for civic inclusion post-Reconstruction. The South was essentially left to its own devices to deal with the race question, and it did so with physical violence, with lynching being the most notorious example, economic restriction through the large-scale enforcement of tenant farming, and the use of intimidation, poll taxes, and literacy tests to prevent African American men from exercising their right to vote. Also, during his term in office, President Wilson restricted federal intervention regarding African American voting rights in the South, and his administration segregated all federal offices in Washington, D.C. Therefore, by the eve of the Great War in Europe, civic inclusion for African Americans had not only been limited by actions across the South, but across the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of the federal government as well. So at this point, African Americans were standing on the cusp of the first Great Migration. The Great Migration is broadly periodized from 1916 to 1970 and defined by historians as the voluntary relocation of approximately 6 million African Americans from the rural South to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. It's often analyzed as separate periods, with the two largest ones surrounding the two world wars. And I want to quickly talk about the first Great Migration, which began in earnest in 1916 and continued until 1930. Approximately 450,000 to 500,000 Southern African Americans relocated to cities between 1916 and 1918, and at least another 700,000 made their way north during the 1920s, with the majority traveling primarily to Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and New York City. This migration reveals that it consisted of 4 stages. During the decision-making process to leave the South, potential migrants utilized specific communication and information networks in determining what opportunities there were for economic and social equality in the North. And those networks included relatives who had already made the move and African-American railroad porters. After those decisions were completed, then in the second stage, individuals and organizations helped facilitate the migration process. And that included members of the Black press, including Robert Abbott, the publisher of the Chicago Defender, who used his editorial and front pages to encourage African Americans to leave the South. Once the migrants arrived at their destinations, progressive reform groups aided their transitions from the rural South. And lastly, synthesizing revolutionary influences from other cultures outside of the South, with their population numbers augmented by the Great Migration, people of color in the North began to develop a new type of protest politics, changing the level of influence they could ultimately bring to bear on the American political system. The Great Migration also meant, though, that Blacks in large numbers were competing with immigrants and white citizens for jobs, housing, and even public space, which ultimately stoked structural and overt racism outside of the South. African reform leaders then fashioned that new form of protest politics, which was born out of the circumstances of the post-Reconstruction era, as well as the reform impulses generated by the Progressive era and the Great Migration. As you probably know, the word progressive began to be generally used around 1910, and it was a term for a political movement comprised of individuals and organizations who recognized the need to make government more democratic, who wanted to balance the effects of industrialization, and who wanted to also place boundaries on corporate power. African American reformers, acting upon those progressive reform impulses of the day, worked to address the issues of civic inclusion, as well as the employment and quality of life issues that would have faced African American migrants going from the rural South to the cities. And so in this process, progressive principles became entwined with the idea of racial uplift, a term the African American reformers themselves used during this period, and one which historians also use to characterize their efforts. So this reform class then was multifaceted and included the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, which became the dominant civil rights organization in the country through its attacks on segregation and racial inequality through the court system. The Urban League, whose advertisement you see there on the slide, founded in 1910, which originally focused its efforts toward addressing issues concerning African American migrants: crime, delinquency, unemployment, and overcrowded housing. There was also the Club Women movement, which addressed equality or quality of life issues through its work with temperance groups, aid societies, and churches. The Black Church, and also the Black Press, which functioned both as a form of protest for the Black communities and an instrument for advancing its causes. And I want to talk about a topic that's been in the news as recently as last month and hopefully give you some historical context on it. This is the act of darkening one's skin to impersonate a person of color. Shorthand term for that is blackface, as you probably know, and it has its historical roots in blackface minstrelsy, which is a subgenre of the minstrel show. See there on the slide, Thomas Dartmouth Rice is known as the father of blackface minstrelsy. It was presented as a form of comedy originally by white traveling musicians whose faces were painted black and who caricatured the singing and dancing of slaves. And you see there Judy Garland, Bing Crosby, the Black and White Minstrel Show from the BBC, and C. Thomas Howell in Soul Man. While this form of blackface was at its most popular in the U.S. and Britain between 1850 and 1870, singer and actor Al Jolson re-energized the genre in 1927 with the film The Jazz Singer. And it went on to be used in numerous films and television programs, both in the US and Britain. But this kind of thing is really insidious. It wasn't just used in film and television. It manifested itself as a much-loved children's doll, which I'm told people still remember here in Ireland. It was used to sell ice cream bars, jams, and even lion's tea. And that's all history, right? But its legacy still exists. The construct still exists and influences behavior in the present day. I think that's the crux. How do we address the factors that make people think it's funny to dress up as a person of color? Oftentimes, the more over the top, the better. Why is that funny to ridicule them? If you're looking for a historical reference to determine the point at which that started, this is it. These actions are a result of decades of this is just a harmless joke, this is just something people do for fun, but that started with a comedy of blackface minstrel shows, and that was coming out of these Jim Crow history. I know that I would conservatively say, for most African Americans who know this history, this is what we see when someone dresses in brown or blackface. Disrespect for who we are, our worth, and our history. So understanding this history is a really good start, because I think probably a lot of people outside of the Black community or outside of historians or people who've studied some Black history don't know this history, and so they wouldn't understand the sting behind it. Speaking of decisions that cause a sting, I was relieved when Donald Trump reversed his decision to hold a political rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on the Juneteenth anniversary. I think he actually was in Tulsa anyway, but it wasn't on the anniversary. But that sparked some curiosity about why holding a rally there was so controversial. Also, it seems that the Tulsa Race Massacre isn't widely known of, so I thought I should include it in my talk. It is one of the bloodiest occurrences of racial violence in the U.S. In 1921, most of Tulsa's 10,000 Black residents lived in a neighborhood called Greenwood, which included a successful business district with the highest concentration of Black businesses in America, often popularly referred to as Black Wall Street. 30th of May, 1921. Sarah Page, a white woman employed as an elevator operator in the Drexel building, told police that 19-year-old Dick Rowland, an African American, attempted to criminally assault her and that he attempted to grab her arm as he entered the elevator. On the 31st of May, the Tulsa Tribune ran a story about the alleged assault. There were rumors that Rowland was to be lynched that night. A crowd of about 400 men stormed the jail when Rowland was being held, and a rumor had circulated back to the Black community that the jail was taken and Rowland was to be lynched. 25 armed African American men went to the jail but were assured of Rowland's safety. They left, but having heard more rumors, they returned to the jail with an additional 50 armed men. The sheriff was somehow again able to persuade them to leave, but as they were leaving, a shot rang out somehow and chaos ensued from there. There were numerous shots on both sides, killing 10 white men and 2 Black men. The Black men were outnumbered. They retreated back to Greenwood, and that's when the destruction of Greenwood began. Deputized whites killed more than 300 African Americans. They looted and burned to the ground 40 square blocks of hospitals, schools, and churches, and over 1,200 African American homes were destroyed, as well as 150 businesses. And that picture doesn't do it justice, but I didn't want to put up 10 pictures of that horror, but you can certainly look it up and see more, but that's a start anyway. White deputies and members of the National Guard arrested and detained 6,000 Black Tulsans who were released only upon being vouched for by either their white employer or other white citizens. 9,000 African Americans were left homeless and lived in tents well into the winter of 1921. Somehow, Rowland had been safely guarded during that riot, and after it was all over, all charges against him were dropped. The police determined that he had accidentally stepped on Sarah Page's foot. Rowland left Tulsa after that, as you would imagine he would. So that's what happened in Tulsa, and that's why it was such an insult, a kick in the stomach, really, for Donald Trump to hold a political rally there on the Juneteenth anniversary. But before we leave this topic, what happened to Dick Rowland was part of a long history, going back to slavery, of a backlash of violence, usually lynching, that occurred against Black men who allegedly or in reality interacted with white women. In the 20th century, the most infamous and probably most widely known incident of that nature was the murder of Emmett Till, 14-year-old African American from Chicago, visiting family in Mississippi in August 1955, who was brutally murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman. His assailants made him carry a 75-pound cotton gin fan to the bank of the Tallahatchie River and ordered him to take off his clothes. The two men then beat him nearly to death, gouged out his eye, shot him in the head, and then threw his body, tied to the cotton gin fan with barbed wire, into the river. Till's mother insisted upon a glass-topped casket for him to raise awareness of the brutality of the crime. The two white men who later confessed to murdering him were acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury. And to relate that back to current events, that history is one of the reasons why there was such outrage over the recent Christian Cooper birdwatching incident in Central Park in New York City. You might remember Christian Cooper, who is Black, was birdwatching in an area in Central Park where dogs were meant to be on their leashes. And he asked Amy Cooper, who is white, to leash her dog. She didn't take the request well, and indicating that she was going to phone the police, replied, "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life." She called the police, saying, "There's an African-American man here. I'm in Central Park. He's recording me and threatening my dog." Now, thank goodness Christian Cooper wasn't killed or hurt, but that could have gone very differently than it did. And again, it was a casual disregard for a Black person's life and safety. Casual, but calculated, because she obviously understood the historical dynamic between them. Now, when I realized that so many people were unaware of the Tulsa Massacre, I thought it would be important to talk to you about Red Summer 1919, that maybe that was something that wasn't widely known as well. 1919, James Weldon Johnson, field secretary for the NAACP, called that summer the Red Summer, and that term has stuck historically because it was the worst spate of race riots and lynchings in American history. I've given you some photos later. You'll see them to demonstrate the climate of violence that summer and the armed camp mentality present in the larger city where the riots occurred. And I'll click through those in a sec. I mean, you can see this on the slide that I've put up there, but the violence enveloped towns, counties, and large cities. And through analysis of government documents, court records, newspaper accounts, and NAACP files, historians have determined that there were at least 25 major riots and mob actions across the country. Some riots were over in hours, but some immobilized Chicago, Washington, Knoxville, Tennessee, my hometown, and Elaine, Arkansas, for days. Of those killed, approximately 100 African Americans were lynched, some of them African American veterans returning back home to the U.S. while still in their U.S. Army uniform. That's another story to talk about later, because African Americans in the First World War did not serve in combat positions in the First World War. They served in service and supply. That's a whole nother story as to why the U.S. Military made that decision, which you don't have time to talk about. But if you look up If you look up the Harlem Hellfighters, perhaps, they're a very famous unit from World War I, and they were actually lent to the French army to fight. So that's it's a whole other story. I have no time to bring it up, but I want you to look at it if you're at all interested. But in Red Summer, tens of thousands of Americans were forced to flee their homes or places of business. Ordinary white civilians and veterans who were not affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan or any other white supremacist organization composed apparently a large number of the mobs. Historians argue that most of the incidents that occurred that year were made worse by local, state, and federal officials who hesitated to take action, or worse, turned a blind eye to the mob violence. So I'll flip through these. I'll go back here for a second. I also want to briefly mention the Immigration Act of 1924, which has been characterized as the legislative expression of the xenophobia, particularly towards Eastern and Southern European immigrants that existed in America in the 1920s. The Immigration Act of 1924 included the Asian Exclusion Act and the National Origins Act, which effectively banned all immigration from Asia and limited immigration of Italians, Eastern European Jews, Greeks, and Poles. And again, this is a manifestation of the social construct of race broadened out to those groups. Because of the events of the past few weeks, I felt I should include a discussion on Confederate monuments in this talk. The debate over Confederate monuments has been framed by Donald Trump as a fight between those who wish to preserve history and those who would erase it. So let's talk about that history and also the concept of history versus public memory. Looking at this chart of when the monuments were erected in the early 1900s and then again in the 1950s and 1960s, all were times of extreme civil rights tension. And we've talked about what was going on in the early 1900s. In the 1950s, the civil rights movement was ramping up into the 1960s. Historians contend that these memorials served three purposes: to honor those who fought in the war, to justify their cause, and to vindicate the South. But historians also argue that what is being vindicated is a social order that upheld white supremacy, sending a message to African Americans during those periods of social unrest. In addition, most of the monuments were erected by groups such as the Daughters of the Confederacy, and as a consequence of the legal structure of white supremacy in the South at that time, African Americans would not have been able to vote against such community actions. As an example of timing, this monument was erected in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II. Coincidentally, this was also the year that President Truman desegregated the U.S. military. I think these monuments should all be in a museum, not just taken down and destroyed. They should all be in a museum, contextualized, so that the full history behind them, the lost cause, white supremacy, and segregation, all of it is made available to understand what these actually mean. Also, in light of the recent decision by the U.S. Marine Corps ordering the removal of all public displays of the Confederate flag from Marine installations, and NASCAR's similar decision to remove the Confederate flag from its facilities, there's a corollary discussion here regarding the Confederate flag, history, and public memory. I'd like to read you an excerpt of what is known as the Cornerstone Speech, given by Alexander H. Stephens in 1861, when this Civil War broke out. Stephens would go on to become the vice president of the Confederacy, and he was speaking about the ethos of the Confederacy. The Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. With us, all of the white race, however high or low, rich or poor, are equal in the eye of the law. Not so with the Negro. Subordination is his place. So the flag of the Confederacy represents that principle. And the condition occupied by Black people in that system was slavery. Those states left the Union to uphold their states' rights to keep Blacks in that condition. The Confederate flag would represent those peoples as any flag does of its country. But sometimes the Confederate flag is thought of as a celebration of Southern heritage, good old boys, even Southern hospitality, that the Civil War was somehow not a result of the separation of the Union, but not over slavery. It's on mugs, posters, featured in television programming throughout the years, and on in popular culture. In the cases of Dylan Ruth, who murdered 9 African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015, and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, the Confederate flag was used in relation to the ethos of the Confederacy as presented in the Cornerstone speech. It was what it says on the tin. And I think when you're trying to work through this discussion, it's important to study primary sources related to the Confederacy, and then look at history and determine when the memory of the Confederacy diverged from the history of the Confederacy. That's a complicated issue involving race and the economic and political necessity for the country to reunite after the Civil War. You all know as well as I do that the public memory of an event is shaped by all sorts of factors, political, social, and personal, and very often the public memory of an event is different from the actual history of that event. I'm going to jump ahead here to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. 1954, the U.S. was still abiding by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that we talked about, the one from 1896, which allowed for separate but equal facilities for African Americans, which of course included the nation's public school system. In the 50s, the NAACP brought support to local cases of unfair school policies. 5 of these cases from 4 states in the District of Columbia were combined in a single appeal that reached the Supreme Court in 1952. When cases are united, they're listed alphabetically, and the first case gives the entire decision its name. So in this case, the first case was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Oliver Brown went to court because his daughter, a 3rd grader, was forced to walk across railroad tracks each morning to get to school a good distance from her home, rather than attend a nearby school, which was white, restricted to white students. Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP's legal division, had decided that it was time to attack the doctrine of separate but equal, not just the practices associated with it. He argued in front of the Supreme Court that even with the same funding and facilities, that segregation was inherently unequal, since it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with another. The new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, managed to create a unanimous decision in the court. And that ruling, this Brown ruling, paved the way for large-scale public school desegregation and overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, ruling that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So schools were in the process of being desegregated, but it was a slow process with a tremendous amount of pushback across the South and less visible but still potent pushback outside of the South until a very high-profile Boston busing crisis in 1974. I'll come back to that when we talk about the 1964 Civil Rights Act in relation to Boston. But the construct of race also undermined a federal program, originally called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but popularly known as the GI Bill. It was originally created to help veterans of World War II and established hospitals. It made low-interest government-backed mortgages available to veterans and granted education stipends covering tuition and expenses for veterans attending college or trade schools. After World War II, you started to see the expansion of the American middle class, the solidification of it, and a significant component of that process was the existence of the GI Bill. While the GI Bill's language did not specifically exclude African American veterans from benefits, the way that it was structured ensured that from the very beginning, those veterans had trouble accessing those benefits. First of all, although it was a federal program, it was administered by the states. This was a compromise to get the Southerners to pass the bill in Congress, and this alone allowed Black veterans to be excluded from those benefits to a large degree. Also, while the GI Bill guaranteed low-interest mortgages and other loans, they were not administered by the Veterans Administration, which is a federal organization, the Veterans Administration itself. So the VA could co-sign, but not actually guarantee those loans. So this gave white-run financial institutions the unmonitored opportunity to refuse mortgages and loans to Black people as they wanted to. If they did secure a mortgage, the use of redlining and real estate covenants determined where they could buy a home. And so what's redlining? It's a decades-old practice of marking maps by race to characterize the risk of lending money and providing insurance, which, as you might imagine, made purchasing a home even more difficult for Black veterans who were pigeonholed into purchasing homes in those areas, Black neighborhoods. Lenders froze out poorer neighborhoods, ensuring that loan assistance and insurance would be denied. And new white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants that denied entry to Black people. Real estate covenants were agreements that could be entered into by a group of property owners, estate developers, or real estate operators in a given area. Covenants prevented these groups from selling, leasing, or renting their property to specific groups because of race, creed, or color for a definite period unless all agreed to the transaction. If an owner violated the restriction, they could be sued or held financially liable. In addition, in a de facto manner, these covenants dictated municipal demographics. In that way, they served to segregate cities without any blame being placed on municipal leaders. So these discriminatory real estate practices, in conjunction with all-white homeownership associations and public housing segregation, produced and maintained segregated neighborhoods. I have a colleague at work who grew up in New Jersey, and her mother, who was my age, sadly, said that often in the town where she grew up, if a Black person looked at a house in her neighborhood, it was taken off the market to prevent them from buying it. This was in 1983. So over time, African Americans were pushed into certain areas of cities, and even as the number of Black residents continued to climb due to the Great Migration, as you remember, ever larger swaths of cities became entirely white until they fled to the suburbs, which is popularly known as white flight. And this laid the groundwork for our contemporary patterns of residential segregation. Now, the suburbs obviously are certainly more multicultural than they were then. But that history is what Donald Trump is playing to when he sent out several tweets in July regarding his administration's plan to rescind the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. He tweeted on the 29th of July, "I'm happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Your housing prices will go up based on the market and crime will go down. I have rescinded the Obama-Biden AFFH rule. Enjoy." The past is never dead. It's not even past. So the post-war housing boom then almost entirely excluded African Americans, most of whom remained in cities that received less and less investment from businesses and banks. In terms of the GI Bill and educational opportunities, as veteran applications flooded universities, Black students often found themselves left out. Northern universities dragged their feet when it came to admitting Black students very often, and Southern colleges barred Blacks almost entirely. Many of those veterans did apply to historically Black colleges, but those were also overrun and underfunded. And the Veterans Administration itself encouraged Black veterans to apply for vocational training instead of university admission and arbitrarily denied educational benefits to some students. As you know, property and education are primary ways to acquire generational wealth. So you can see how these disparities in the implementation of a far-reaching program like the GI Bill helped drive growing gaps in wealth and education between white and Black Americans, gaps that still stand. I want to briefly touch on the federal legislation passed during the 1960s civil rights movement. January 23rd, 1964, the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax. 2nd of July, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, or national origin, and also provided the federal government with the powers to enforce desegregation. 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, making it easier for Southern African Americans to register to vote. 1967, in Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibiting interracial marriage was unconstitutional. 16 states that still banned interracial marriage in 1967 were forced to revise their laws. And those are all incredible, important steps forward that changed our national legal structure with respect to civil rights. But they are federal legal protections. You'll remember the 3 constitutional amendments after the Civil War, guaranteeing the end of slavery, federal protection of citizenship, and prohibiting voting restrictions. Slavery ended in 1865. The Civil Rights Act was passed almost 100 years later in 1964. But even the Civil Rights Act had its compromises in that it refused to address de facto segregation of schools and the types of neighborhoods we've been discussing, those shaped by real estate covenants, white homeowner associations, and the like. In defining the type of desegregation that the legislation was mandating, there was a caveat, and it said, quoting here from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, desegregation means the assignment of students to public schools and within such schools without regard to their race, color, religion, or national origin. But desegregation shall not mean the assignment of students to public schools in order to overcome racial imbalance. And that leads me to this. Organized resistance to school desegregation in the North started in the 1950s, the mid-1950s. And as early as 1957, white parents in New York protested against a proposed plan to transfer 400 Black and Puerto Rican students from Brooklyn to schools in Queens. In Detroit, in 1960, thousands of white parents organized a school boycott to protest the busing of 300 Black students from an overcrowded school in a Black area to a school in a white neighborhood. With busing, some Northerners had found an acceptable way to oppose segregation instead of the overt racism associated with Southerners. Those white parents and politicians framed their resistance to school desegregation using terms such as busing and neighborhood schools, and this allowed them to support white schools and neighborhoods without using explicitly racist language. The beginning of forced busing in Boston on the 12th of September 1974 was busing school children of color across town to achieve integration was met with a massive white backlash. Protests against busing continued unabated for months, and many of the protesters cited the language in the 1964 Civil Rights Act as validation. In October, the National Guard was mobilized to enforce the federal desegregation order. 2 prominent figures during the Boston busing crisis were Judge W. Arthur Garrity, who filed the court order to integrate segregated schools, and Senator Edward Kennedy, who was criticized for passionately supporting the busing initiative and who was often threatened with physical violence for that support. So the civil rights movement yielded substantial federal protections of civil rights. Yet, and this is the last time I'll say this, the construct of race remained in that situation and remains today despite federal legal protections. That construct of race that permitted American democratic principles and slavery to coexist has underpinned everything I've spoken to you about tonight. As President Barack Obama said at the opening of the National African American Museum in 2016, protest and love of country don't merely coexist, but inform each other. In America, we now have to speak out and have the painful conversations that the founding generation was unwilling to have in order to bring the U.S. closer to its founding principles, ones that I certainly cherish. So what exactly does Black Lives Matter mean, and why is this time different? First of all, Black Lives Matter does not mean that only Black lives matter. It means that Black lives matter too. Black Lives Matter actually means that all lives matter, including Black lives, so that when I hear all lives matter, I say absolutely. Black people just want to be part of that all. So why is this time different? I think it might be different because to see the way that George Floyd's life was so callously and casually taken makes it impossible to say that racism isn't a problem in America. There have been so many instances like this but to actually see it as it happened has created a sea change, I think. You can't ignore that in good conscience. Also, I think at a time when at the moment we're limited in what we can do as individuals to address the pandemic, to address unemployment, but here we can make a difference. We can influence how the country moves forward by exercising our constitutional right to protest and by voting in November. People seem to really want to understand how the country got to this point and why we haven't been able to move past it. People are willing to have really tough conversations, and I think that's how change starts. And I also think it's a real cause for hope. So I'll end that here. I know it was a lot to take in. I hope that you learned a couple of things and that you enjoyed listening to it. Thank you.